Podcasting to you from the beautiful Pacific Northwest. I'm your host, Brad Johnson. Welcome to The Theory of Wine. Happy New Year's, wine friends. In today's podcast, we talk with Augusta Winery owner and winemaker Tony Kooyumjian, a third-generation vineyard owner and grape grower. We'll be talking about wine history, French grapevines, Daniel Boone, and how it all fits in with Missouri. Stick around. Support for this podcast comes from the new documentary film Wine Diamonds, Uncorking America's Heartland, streaming now at winediamondsfilm.com and from wineryboost.com, influence marketing for the wine industry. My guest, Tony Kooyumjian, is the owner winemaker of Augusta Winery, located in Augusta, Missouri, and is a third-generation vineyard owner and grape grower. Winemaking is in Tony's blood, as his grandmother immigrated to California from Armenia in 1915 to escape the massacres taking place in ancient Armenia during the time of Ottoman rule. She established a vineyard in the San Joaquin Valley, which she operated with her son until 1960. Tony Kooyumjian began his professional career as an airline pilot, traveling around the globe and embracing fine wines. It was around then that the rebirth of the Missouri wine industry was taking off. In 1980, Tony crafted his first wines, producing 420 cases. By 1998, Tony was flying full-time for American Airlines, owned 2 Missouri wineries, and in 2001, decided to retire from flying and devote his full attention to the wine business. Today, Augusta Winery produces fine wines, has won Best of Show awards in important wine competitions, Best Imported Wine to Germany, and 5 Missouri Governor Cup awards. Tony Kooyumjian, welcome to The Theory of Wine.
Thank you.
Wow. I've been around the Midwest wine industry for a while, and your name and your winery's name is always at the top of people's lists in terms of the best wines out there. And I'll circle back to some of the award stuff later on in our conversation. But I'm curious about your story. You know, you've got quite an interesting history. A third generation winemaker. Kind of maybe circle back and tell a little bit about how all this stuff came to be, your history and how you got into wine.
Well, actually, I'm third generation grape grower. My grandmother started the vineyard in the San Joaquin Valley, not too far from Fresno. And of course, I was there when all this was happening, and got a chance to work on the vineyard and see what the industry was like. And by the time it came for me to make a decision on which way my career was going to go, I decided that I didn't want to be a farmer. Mm-hmm. And so I went to school and got my pilot's licenses and went to work for the airlines. And after flying for the airlines for a number of years, I started flying international, mainly to Western Europe. Mm-hmm. And I planned my trips so that I had time to spend in France or in Germany or in Spain, wherever we had a layover, so that I could go around and visit some of the wineries in the local area. Mm. And what I found out was that there was something really interesting in the fact that each place you went to, even within one particular growing area, the wines were just a little bit different, a little bit unique. The owners took great pride in the wines they produced, and everybody felt that their product was just a little bit unique, and it was. And that really sparked my interest, and I thought, well, maybe I could do this. And about that time, the state of Missouri was putting in a lot of effort into getting more wineries opened in the state. And so I kind of jumped on that bandwagon.
Mm-hmm. So your family had grape growing operation in California, San Joaquin Valley. And so did you grow up in California? And if so, how'd you find your way to Missouri?
Well, I started out in California, of course. And then when I decided I was going to choose a career path of being an airline pilot, and after my college, I got hired by TWA, mm-hmm. and one of their main bases was in St. Louis, so that's where I ended up in the St. Louis area.
Okay, that makes sense. So you recognize there was a rebirth of the Missouri wine industry, and there are probably people around the country that don't know the history of the Missouri wine industry. I mean, it's pretty interesting, I think. I mean, I don't know how much you can tell us about it, but I'd be curious to kind of get your take on that.
Well, it was interesting, and so, I mean, the immigrants started to move into Missouri shortly after the Louisiana land purchase. And you had a lot of German immigrants that were coming into Missouri and settling along the Missouri River, perhaps because it reminded them of Germany because of the Rhine River and such. That's some of the explanations that I've heard. But the centers of commerce in Missouri in those days were all situated around rivers. There really wasn't any other type of transportation at that point other than riverboats. So as the German immigrants settled into the Missouri area, they had originally planned on growing row crops. Cereal grains and vegetables and stuff like that. But what they found out is that the Daniel Boone's followers had beat them to the best spots. They picked out all the bottom ground, and the only thing that was left for them to settle was the hillsides. So they were undaunted. They staked out their properties on the hillsides and then learned about what they could grow in those areas, and they found out that they could have orchards, they could have vineyards. It so happened that because of where these people came from in Germany, they chose vineyards, and they really did a good study on it. They found out which grapes would grow well in the Midwest, and a lot of this they learned on their trip from the East Coast to Missouri. There was a lot of German immigrants along the way, and they were growing grapes and making wine. So they learned a lot about, which types of grapes to choose. And they later on ordered grapevines. They planted them. They built a thriving industry. And at one time before Prohibition, Missouri was the second largest producer of wine in the United States.
Wow.
And, so everything was going well. They were settled on the river. There was good land to grow the grapes. And of course, the transportation system was right there, which was the riverboats. And of course, in those days, all the wine was shipped in barrels, and it went to the East Coast, mainly because they didn't have very much wine production on the East Coast. There was a demand for it, and so I guess the frontiers, which Missouri was at that time, provided wine for the major portion of the population in the United States at that time.
That's impressive. The second largest producer of wine back before Prohibition. That's ridiculous. And that's probably something most people don't have a clue about.
No, and the thing that's interesting is the number one producer was Ohio.
No kidding. So these early, this is amazing. So these early winemaking folks brought their winemaking traditions with them, like we probably do when we go places. What were the early grapes that they're putting in the ground back then?
Well, the interesting thing is that they were, contrary to what a lot of people think, they did not bring Johannesburg Riesling with them and plant Johannesburg Riesling. They learned enough from the other immigrants, German immigrants that were in the area, that they needed to plant American varieties or American hybrids because they were resistant to phylloxera. They were resistant to a lot of the pests. They were resistant to mold and mildew. And they grew without a lot of intervention. So they were growing Norton, they were growing Catawba, they were growing Concord grapes. So it was mostly Labrusca type grapes and American hybrids. And the funny thing about it is that they were hybridizing American varieties quickly. You know, the people that came and settled in Missouri were not farmers by upbringing. They were educators, they were lawyers, they were doctors, they were chemists, they were scientists. So when they came to this area, and they came to Missouri because they were looking for a new way of life, new freedoms, and they figured, well, I'm going to have to make it as a farmer. So they did a lot of research, and they found out about grape growing and farming, and then they thought, well, we want to improve the varieties that they're currently growing. So they started hybridizing some of the varieties, and they came up with thousands of different types of American hybrids, and they did well. They produced good wine.
So in Missouri right now, what are the top varieties that people may be aware of or may not be aware of?
Well, right now in Missouri, primarily we're growing French American hybrids. So if you're not familiar with French American, well, I know you're familiar with French American hybrids, but for those of you who are not, in France, when France was wanting to learn more about the varieties that were growing wild in the United States, they imported some of the Native American grapes, and along with these Native American grapes came the bug or the louse, phylloxera, and the American varieties were resistant to phylloxera, but the vinifera varieties that were being grown in France were not, because they didn't have that particular insect there. And so what it did is it started eating away at the roots of the vinifera vines and started gradually killing all the vines in France. And they wanted to come up with a solution, and so they set their scientists to work on this. And of course, most of this work was done in southern France and Montpellier. And what they started doing was they started hybridizing or cross-pollinating American grape varieties with the French grape varieties. And what they were trying to do is they were trying to get a grape that would make wine that would be similar to what they had before with the vinifera varieties. While they were doing this, they also said, as long as we're going through all this work, why don't we come up with a grapevine that's resistant to the normal pests that we see in France, and that's powdery mildew and downy mildew and insect pests and stuff like that. And so they bred these varieties so that they were more resistant, much more resistant than the vinifera grapes. They spent a lot of time doing that, and they came up with thousands of different varieties of grapes. They started planting these French American hybrids, only to later on discover that it was a much better idea to just take the vinifera grapevine and graft it to the American rootstock. And of course, that's what they did, and that's how they were able to save the industry. Interesting enough, most of that rootstock came from Missouri. And one of the entomologists in Missouri actually came up with the solution and helped France source rootstock for grafting over. The French American hybrids probably would have just been lost after that, because once they discovered that they could have the vinifera grapevines back, the ones that everybody was used to and they were used to making wine from, they completely dropped the idea of the French American hybrid. And in fact, they made people that had planted them previously take them out. And it was in the late 50s, early 60s that they actually released these hybrids to anybody in the world that was interested in experimenting with them. And as it turned out, some people from the East Coast of the United States started bringing some in and propagating them. And what they found out is they grew well in places where vinifera really wouldn't grow well, either because of fluctuations in the temperature or because of cold winters. These hybrids are much more resistant to cold weather. They'll handle much colder weather than a vinifera variety would. So gradually, those same varieties made their way into Missouri and other Midwest states, and that was about the time that I started in the industry. And so I started planting these grapes and making wine from them. And it's been 39 years now, and we're still experimenting. I think we have a pretty good foundation for which varieties do the best. And since then, they've come out with new hybrid varieties that have been hybridized in the United States, not in France. And we're gradually kind of improving the vines that we have here. So to answer your original question, the variety that is most type of grape that's most grown in Missouri is the French American hybrid and the American Native American species of grapes. And out of the white varieties, we grow a lot of Seyval Blanc, Vidal Blanc, Chardonnay, Traminette, Valvin Muscat. I'm sure there's a few more that I can't think of right now. And out of the red varieties, Chamberson tends to be our favorite. So out of our red wines, they're primarily made from Chamberson, the French hybrid, and Norton, which is the Native American grape.
Of the grapes that you grow, which ones are your favorites in terms of like ease of growing and just kind of fun to play around with in the cellar? Well,
my favorite is the Norton, and it's because it's hardy stock. You know, we never have any loss of these vines due to cold temperatures, no matter how cold it gets during the wintertime. It doesn't require a lot of intervention because it's not it's resistant to your major diseases that you get normally on grapevines, like powdery mildew and downy mildew. And so it's an ease to grow. And we've found good places on our farm to grow it. We have 500 acres of land. It's not all in grapevine because we only choose the best spots to put the grapevines in, mainly because of the exposure to the sun and the drainage of the water drainage of the soil, and just the elevation above the river. All these things make a lot of difference in growing French American hybrids and Native American grapes in Missouri. The funny thing about it is that a lot of people, of course, are more familiar with vinifera grapes.
Right.
And they're always asking, you know, well, how come you don't have Cabernet Sauvignon, or how come you don't have Merlot or Chardonnay? And some of those grapes would actually grow in Missouri. I mean, you could grow them and keep them alive.
Okay.
The big problem that we have is the unsettled weather in the wintertime. So starting in towards the end of December all the way through March, a lot of times if we get a low pressure area just south of Missouri, so between where we're at in Missouri and the Gulf of Mexico, the low pressure area will start to bring warm air up from the Gulf of Mexico, and it'll warm up substantially. So, in January, where we're normally having temperatures in the 20s and 30s and 40s, the temperatures will get up to 70 degrees, and they'll stay that way for 4 or 5 days. And then the other part of the low pressure area swings through, and you pull cold air down from Canada, and it'll go from 70 degrees down to 20 or 30 degrees or colder in a matter of 24, 48 hours. And the vinifera grapes have a hard time with this change in weather, because vinifera grapes start to bud out at the first thought of springtime or warm weather, whereas the French American hybrids and the Native American grapes, it takes a lot to get them out of dormancy. So they can go through 2 or 3 of these warm cold cycles, and they'll still be 100% dormant. And then typically in April, the end of April, the beginning of May, then we'll start to get bud break. And by that time, most of these cold weather fluctuations are done with.
We'll be back in a moment with the final half of our interview with Augusta Winery owner and winemaker Tony Kooyumjian. Hey wine friends, each week the Theory of Wine will bring you interesting content from winemakers, wine growers, wine rebels, writers and bloggers, and serious wine nerds from around the world. Want to join us? Connect with us at theoryofwine.com, on Facebook, or Twitter. Cheers, friends. Cheers to the second season of the Theory of Wine podcast. You know we love the wine world and want to connect with interesting wine people. Got somebody in mind? Want to be on the show? Got a story idea? We'd love to hear from you. Drop us a note at theoryofwine.com, on our Facebook and Twitter page at Theory of Wine. Cheers, wine friends. Welcome back to the second half of our interview with Augusta Winery owner and winemaker Tony Kooyumjian as we discuss grape growing, the oldest AVA, and Norton Wine Month in Missouri. So that makes me wonder about, when do you prune these things? Because they're just like kind of going into hibernation, kind of getting woken up, back into hibernation. I mean, at what point do you decide to do your annual pruning on your vines?
We usually start in December. The vinifers will come out of dormancy if there's warm weather. The French American hybrids don't. So once the leaves are off the vine and we've had 4 weeks of cold weather, and so when I'm talking about cold weather, I'm talking about weather below freezing.
Right.
They're dormant. Of course, the longer you wait, the more dormant they become. And in a perfect world, we'd probably wait until the end of February and prune everything. But we couldn't get the entire vineyard done if we waited that long. So we start in December, and we're usually done a week or two before bud break, hopefully.
I know your part of the world, your part around Augusta, Missouri, is known as a special kind of designation in terms of the wine world, the AVAs. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so Augusta is the first designated AVA, or American Viticultural Area, in the United States. And this all started in the late 70s. And maybe it was prompted because of the wine tasting in Paris with the California wines during our bicentennial. I'm not sure, but at that time it was the BATF, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, came up with the idea that the United States didn't have any way to define the area where wine was made or where the grapes were grown for a wine, other than for a state and for a county. So in our case, we could call our wine Missouri, or we could call it St. Charles County. In California, they could call it Napa County or Sonoma County. But they really couldn't designate anything finer than that. And for people that are familiar with fine wines and can distinguish the difference between wines grown on different soils and different temperatures and stuff like that, this was really important to know when they were making a selection. And so what the government decided that they were going to do is they were going to try to establish a system similar to what they had in France and Germany and Italy, where there would be designated viticultural areas. And what they did is they send out a notice of proposed rulemaking, which is the way the government operates, and they sent it to all the wineries and asked, everybody's opinion, and most people were in favor of it. And so they proceeded with the paperwork, and they started accepting applications for American viticultural areas. And at that time in Augusta, we had some really knowledgeable people that were not only making wine, but were also interested in wine and interested in the area. And so I got to give them a lot of credit, because they were the people that filled out the paperwork and make sure it got to the government in a timely manner. And it so happened that the BATF chose to interview Augusta first. That was in '79.
Okay.
And they actually came to Augusta. They met at our American Legion Hall, and we showed them the maps, and we showed them what we had, and told them why we thought this was such a unique area, because the people that were involved in it knew that in order to qualify as a viticultural area, that it had to be unique from the other areas that were surrounding it. It had to be somehow different. Right. And our area was different for a number of reasons, but probably the most significant reason is because 10,000 years ago, the continental glacier was rumbling down the center of the United States, and it so happened to stop right at Augusta. That was the terminal moraine for the last continental glacier. So what this glacier did was it brought in a lot of soils that were not indigenous to this area, brought in a lot of fertile soils, brought in a lot of mineral content. And because of this mineral content in the sand and the silica and the granite that were all ground up while the glacier was headed south, these soils are extremely well drained. And that's one of the things that's, I think, almost always a common denominator in good growing areas, is that they have well-drained soils. Grapevines thrive in well-drained soils. And that was one aspect. The other aspect was the fact that we have a ridge to our north and northwest. Actually, the ridge, it's called the Osage Ridge, named after the Indians. Mm-hmm. And it surrounds the Augusta AVA in kind of a crescent shape. So to the north and northwest is this high ridge, which is generally about 300 feet higher than the highest vineyards. And then down below that, you have the Missouri River Valley and the Missouri River, which is kind of a heat sink, keeps things a little bit warmer in the wintertime. And the ridge itself, when we get these really cold storms coming out of the north and northwest, bringing in cold temperatures, all that cold air is kind of blown up over the vineyards, and we have this little warm crescent that's, good for our grapes. Otherwise, the grapes, we'd have a lot of loss in grapes every year due to cold damage. So that's the second most important factor. And then the third factor was the history of this area. So it's kind of unique, the fact that it was settled by Daniel Boone and his followers. And then later on, the German immigrants came in and they planted the vineyards and created a wonderful industry in the state. And I guess the people from the Treasury Department liked what we presented, so they granted us the #1 AVA in the United States, and that was in June 20th, 1980.
Nice.
And the second AVA that they designated was 8 months later, and that was Napa Valley.
Wow. See, these are incredible tidbits of history that a lot of us are unaware of. Second largest producer of grapes and wine prior to Prohibition, the first American viticultural area. What other exciting news do you have for us here about? I mean, I'm thinking winery visitors. What are they saying about Missouri wines when they come through your winery?
Well, most people are pleasantly surprised. So people that have visited, California and Oregon and Washington, they're familiar with all the vinifera grape varieties and the wines, and that's what's on the tip of everybody's tongue is Cabernet or Merlot or Chardonnay. They come here and they're exposed to a completely different type of grape, and it has unique flavors. Plus, I feel the soils and the climate that we have here add a lot to those flavors as well. And to them, it's like they're making a new discovery. They said, well, we've never heard of these grapes before. We've never tasted a Seyval Blanc or a Vidal Blanc or a Chambourcin, but we really like it, because it gives us some variety in the wines that we can enjoy. And, we've been, the Missouri industry is, even after the 60s, we've had a lot of time to experiment with the types of grapes, how to grow them, how to vinify them, and I guess most importantly, how to market them.
Sure.
Missouri, even with the resurgence, isn't brand new in the industry. It did take us a long time to get started once they repealed Prohibition. When I think about it, I think it's because of the people that settled in Missouri. It was, by and large, almost all German immigrants. And so they were very ambitious and very intelligent and hardworking. And so when they came here and built this industry up, and then were later on told that not only did they have to stop making wine, but they had to destroy the wine that they had in stock. They couldn't sell it anymore. And, you know, the same thing happened in California, you know, I mean, primarily in the Central Valley is where they were growing grapes at that time. And it was mostly French and Italian farmers. And, you know, when the government said, you know, you can't make wine anymore, they figured, well, you know, we've seen this before. We've seen it in our old countries, and it'll change. You know, a new a political regime will come in, and they're going to change it, and then we'll be able to make wine again. And so the Germans got mad, and they tore up all the vineyards, and they put in other types of crops, sometimes orchards, sometimes row crops. Whereas the French and the Italians in California, they didn't tear up their vineyards. They allowed the vineyards to grow, and they figured out different ways that they could make money. And essentially what they did during Prohibition is they loaded all the grapes onto railroad cars and sent them out to the east. And then the grapes were sold on the eastern, midwestern, and eastern part of the United States as wines to make, or grapes to make wine in their home. And I forget exactly what they were allowed, 1 or 2 barrels. And so that kept the California vineyards going. That kept them in business until the repeal of Prohibition. And then once that happened, and they knew it was coming, and of course they were supporting the repeal of Prohibition, they had a lot of grapes available, and they were ready to jump right in with both feet. And of course, in Missouri and other parts of the Midwest, nobody was even thinking about it.
Right. Wow. That's an incredible story. I'm thinking about the people that come into your winery and taste your wines. And, you know, I've been there. I've worked the tasting room in the Midwest. And people are sometimes skeptical, but I'm looking at the competition awards. I'm seeing Best of Show in California wine competitions, Best Imported Wine to Germany. I just looked at the Mid-America Wine Competition website before we start chatting here. And the Mid-America Wine Competition is pretty cool. I was kind of peripherally involved with that as a wine student back in the day. But this is a wine competition by Bob Foster and Doug Frost. And Doug Frost is a master sommelier and master of wine. He's a really highly respected wine guy. He's one of 4 people in the world that have those credentials, and they bring in wine from the Midwest, in Middle America, and they judge it, and they love it. And I just noticed before I came here, the 2017 and 2018 best red wine for the, I think 2014 and 2015 estate bottled Norton were your wines. So that's high praise. I mean, if you got the best guys in the world, best people in the world saying these wines are awesome, I think it's time for the rest of us to kind of like take note. And yeah, Cabernets are great, and Merlots are great, and Chardonnays are great, but there's some really amazing wines that are being made in places that people may not even know about. And so,
I mean, and what we ask people to do is keep an open mind. You know, don't come in and say, well, because this is a hybrid, it's not going to taste as good as a vinifera grape. You know, I mean, reserve your judgment until you've actually tasted it. You know, the fact of the matter is that vinifera grapes produce very good wine. So do French American hybrids. But vinifera grapes, in order to produce the quality that will produce awards and high praise, they have to be grown in a very specific climate. They have to be grown in a Mediterranean climate, or in a climate that's where the grapes are at high elevation, and so you get the changes in temperature between the day and the night. And you get the same thing in a maritime climate or a Mediterranean climate. But, you know, less than 3% of the world has those kind of climates. So it's very specific where you can grow these grapes. And when you try to grow them outside of those areas, the wines that they produce are not very profound. You know, when you compare a Cabernet Sauvignon grown in Napa Valley or Sonoma Valley or the Central Coast to a Cabernet Sauvignon that's grown in and I'll use my hometown, Fresno. Mm-hmm. There's a complete difference in the flavors and the taste of that wine to the point where it would be hard to distinguish as the same grape. Mm-hmm. You know, a grape grown in Napa Valley, Cabernet grown in Napa Valley tastes so much different than a Cabernet that's grown in southern San Joaquin Valley. Mm-hmm. So it really depends on where the grape is grown, and that's what I've spent a lot of time personally, and the state of Missouri has spent a lot of time, is trying to find which one of these hybrids will grow best in certain areas. And we've been able to find the proper grape in the proper location and come up with something really, really wonderful. So, you know, a lot of people, when they come in for a wine tasting, sometimes they're coming in with, they may be from out of town, but they're coming in with friends that live in the Missouri area. And you can tell they've got a chip on their shoulder. You know, it's like, oh, I know I'm not going to like these wines, you know. And fortunately, you know, we've got some great people that work in the winery, great salespeople. And we've educated them well. You know, the people that are giving the tastings at our wineries are not only knowledgeable, and they take the tests and they take training from other people that have been there longer, but they get involved in the entire process. So, you know, they'll come out for harvest to see what we're doing, to see the grapes when they're picked, or they'll come out when we're crushing the grapes or pumping over the reds or bottling the wine. So they have an intimate understanding of how these wines are made, and they're able to educate the people that come in. And, you know, I think that's important. You know, I mean, they know that we've got to convince people that we have a good product, a unique product. Mm-hmm. Whereas, you know, you go to California, you go to Napa Valley, Sonoma, and I don't want to say that they have an attitude, but they truly feel that, you know, their product is the best in the world, and they don't have to sell it or explain it. Right. And we do.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you just really need to have an open mind. And I think like this January, it's Norton month in Missouri, and Norton is a grape that and I love Norton. Norton is just, it's a really strong personality. I like kind of attribute personalities to wine. Norton is a wine that has a strong personality that I just absolutely love. And can you tell us, just because I want to kind of wrap this up here, Tony, can you tell us about your Norton and what it is about Norton that's cool to you, and tell us a little bit about January as Norton month for Missouri.
Okay. Well, like I say, I said before, I really love the Norton grape because it's indigenous to the United States. Mm-hmm. It's easy to grow. It loves growing in this area. It likes the cold winters. It likes the hot, humid summers. And it consistently produces a good quality grape. And over the last 39 years, I've learned how to grow the grape in the vineyard, mm-hmm. and how to make the wine. And, you know, my philosophy is we don't intervene a lot when we're making the wine. We intervene a lot when we're growing the grape. So we've worked with different types of trellising systems, different type of leaf exposure, different type of leaf thinning, different crop levels, and various things like that. And we're dealing right now with Norton grapes that have in the same location, grown in the same location for quite some time. And I guess my one objection to the Norton Grape, the one thing that kind of holds it back a little bit, is the fact that it has high natural acidity. Mm-hmm. And so it's a little tart, especially when it's compared to a California Cabernet that has, relatively low acidity, much lower acidity than Norton. Mm-hmm. But I've learned to farm it in such a way that the acidity is now down into more of a manageable area. And the wines still taste fresh. You can taste the acidity, right. And it elevates all these really unique flavors that Norton has. And it changes a lot from vintage to vintage. That's why vintage dating Norton is imperative. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you'll get more of your high tones like raspberry and cranberry, and then other years you'll get more of the blackberry and black plum and mulberry and elderberry, some of those darker flavors. Right. And in a good year, the fruit just soars from the glass, and you get a lot of really vivid aromas. The tastes are very pronounced and full of fruit flavors. And like I say, our barrel program doesn't rely on the flavors from the barrel to enhance the wine. We have a program where very few of the barrels are brand new. Most of them have been used 2 or 3 times. Okay. And so we try to just bring our customer the wine with the natural flavors, that natural spiciness. And of course, January is the perfect month because, Norton goes good with meats. Mm-hmm. It particularly goes good with fatty meats, so it goes good with sausages. It goes good with ribeye steaks with a lot of marbling in it. It goes good with rich cheeses. It goes good with pastas that have a lot of cheese and rich sauces. And that's what people are eating in the Midwest this time of year, comfort foods, and Norton pairs with those comfort foods perfectly.
Well, Tony, I want people to try these wines. I want them to try your wines. I want them to experience Norton. I want them to sample Champerson, Saval, Vidal, Traminette, Chardonnay. I mean, there's so many wonderful wines in the Midwest. Tony Kooyumjian, thank you so much for talking with us today. It's been a real pleasure.
Okay, and thank you, Brad.
Tony Kooyumjian is the owner and winemaker of Augusta Winery, located in Augusta, Missouri, as a third-generation vineyard owner and grape grower. Want to know more about Augusta Winery? Check out their website at augustawinery.com. I'll post links to their website and contact information on my theoryofwine.com blog. Hey wine friends, thanks for hanging out with us for Theory of Wine podcast, brought to you by a new wine documentary called Wine Diamonds, Uncorking America's Heartland, now available online at winediamondsfilm.com and wineryboost.com, influence marketing for the wine industry. Thanks for listening, downloading, and sharing us. Find us at theoryofwine.com. See you next time. Cheers, friends.